Good morning. Bon matin. I'm very happy to have you here, and we are continuing our study on comprehensive and specific land claims. But first, we want to always recognize our history in Canada and the fact that we are in a process of truth and reconciliation, in particular for this committee, Indigenous and Northern Affairs. We are here on the unceded territory of the Algonquin people. So pursuant to Standing Order 1082, a study on the specific claims and comprehensive land claims agreement, we are hearing witnesses, and this morning we have the pleasure of hosting the Office of the Auditor General. And we have with us Michael Ferguson, Joe Matari, and James Mackenzie. You will have 10 minutes to present. I'll give some hand signals when we're getting close to the end time or give you the number of minutes left. And then members will have questions for you. The first round is 7 minutes. You'll respond. Then it'll move to another member. And I'll try and keep you aware of how the session is moving and if we're coming close to a cutoff time. All right, so shall we begin? I turn the floor over to you, and you have 10 minutes to present. Thank you.
Merci. Madame la Présidente, je veux...
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to present the results of two of our audits. One on First Nations specific claims, and the other on implementing the Labrador Inuit Land Claims Agreement. Joining me today are Joe Martir and James Mackenzie, the principals who were responsible for the audits. I should first note that we completed the work for these audits in July 2016 and September 2015, and we have not conducted audit work on these topics since then. The federal government has long acknowledged that it has not always met its obligations to First Nations under historic treaties or properly managed First Nations funds or other assets. In 2007, the government started a new process called Justice at Last. This was to resolve long-standing grievances more quickly, fairly, and transparently, preferably through negotiations.
Specific claims examined whether Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada adequately managed the resolution of these claims. We focused on whether First Nations had adequate access to the specific claims process, whether claims were resolved in line with Justice at Last, and whether results were reported publicly. Overall, we found that Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada didn't adequately manage the resolution of First Nation-specific claims in line with the new process. For example, the Department wanted more claims to be resolved than received each year, but we found that the Department achieved this objective in only 2 of the 8 years since Justice at Last came into force. Furthermore, the Department stated that every reasonable effort would be made to achieve settlements through negotiations. However, we found that more claims were either closed by the Department or ended up in litigation than were resolved through negotiation. We also found that the Department's reforms of the specific claims process weren't developed in consultation with First Nations, and that the reforms introduced barriers that hindered First Nations access to the process and impeded the resolution of claims. These barriers included certain practices such as take-it-or-leave-it offers for claims that the Department deemed to be valued at under $3 million, significant unilateral cuts in funding to First Nations to prepare their claims, and very limited use of mediation services. Le ministère n'a pas non...
Department also did not use available information to improve the specific claims process. This information included concerns raised by First Nations and organizations representing First Nations about how the Department was implementing the new process. It also included the specific claims tribunal decisions, most of which were in favor of First Nations. Finally, we found that the department's public reports did not contain the information needed to understand the actual results of the specific claims process. For example, the department publicly reported that the 2007 reforms were a success. However, we found that most of the settled claims used to support this assertion were already resolved or almost resolved before justice at last was implemented.
2017 Public Accounts of Canada, the government has acknowledged an outstanding liability of $5.3 billion for 528 specific claims. I would like to turn now to our 2015 report on implementing the Labrador Inuit Land Claims Agreement. In this audit, we focused on whether Fisheries and Oceans Canada, Parks Canada, and Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada implemented selected obligations in the Labrador Inuit Land Claims Agreement and in two related side agreements, one on fiscal financing and the other on the Labrador Inuit Park impacts and benefits. We found that the federal government made progress on some of its obligations under the Labrador Inuit Land Claims Agreement. For example, Parks Canada had managed the Torngat Mountains National Park to provide employment and business opportunities to Labrador Inuit. However, we found disagreements in some areas, such as fishing and housing. For example, Fisheries and Oceans Canada and the Nunatsiavut government disagreed over the share of the northern shrimp fishery that the Nunatsiavut government was entitled to receive under the agreement. Furthermore, the lack of a federal program for Inuit housing had limited the ability of the Nunatsiavut government to fulfill its housing responsibilities. The failure to resolve differences put a strain on the relationship between these two governments, yet the dispute resolution mechanism contained in the Labrador Inuit Land Claims Agreement was not used to resolve these issues. Enfin, nous avons constaté que...
Lastly, we found that Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada did not have an effective system to track the status of the federal government's obligations under the agreement. Following the tabling of our 2015 and 2016 fall reports in Parliament, all departments that we audited presented an action plan to the Standing Committee on Public Accounts to address our recommendations. Your committee may wish to ask them for an update on the implementation of their commitments. Madam Chair, this concludes my opening statement. We'd be pleased to answer any questions the committee may have. Thank you.
Questions? Thank you very much. The first round of questions comes to the Liberal side, and we will open with MP Mike Bossio.
Thank you so much for being here this morning, Auditor General. It's greatly appreciated. We appreciate all the work that you've done on this file, and looking at the history of land claims as it relates to, or the most recent history as it relates to the Justice at Last reports. And we've had a number of meetings already with a number of Indigenous groups. We've traveled across the country and met with a number of them around specific and comprehensive land claims. And there's a number of issues that are coming up again and again and again, and a lot of them relate to around funding for funding in two respects: funding for research to be able to carry out the lands claims process, and funding to participate as part of the lands claims process, and the amount of debt that groups incur to be a part of that process. I wonder if you could elaborate on in your reports as to these claims that have been made by different Indigenous groups, and whether you have any findings around those areas.
Thank you. Well, certainly when we looked at the specific claims specific claims process, one of the obstacles that we identified, one of the barriers that we felt prevented the Justice at Last program from functioning the way that it was intended to function, was that the Department of Indigenous Affairs had reduced the budget that they provided to First Nations to do their research. I believe that the people that did the research have told us that they were only able to do, at least one group of researchers who dealt with a number of First Nations said that they would only be able to do one research into one claim every 10 years for each of those First Nations that they represented. So it certainly was an issue. We identified in the report that the funding that the department had provided in 2013-14 for research, funding they provided for research to First Nations was $7.8 million. By 2015-16, that had dropped to $4.7 million. So, you know, a significant reduction in the amount of money that was provided to the First Nations for them to do the research. So that certainly was a barrier we identified.
And was there a direct correlation between that barrier and the actual resolution of specific claims as a result of reduction in the ability of First Nations to actively participate in the process?
Well, as I said, we identified a number of different barriers that we felt meant that the program didn't work the way that it was intended to work. One of them was the fact that there wasn't, you know, the funding available. Others that we identified were, you know, again, I think as I mentioned in my opening statement, was that the department decided that if something was a low-value claim, and the department themselves identified what a low-value claim was, anything that they thought would take less than $3 million to settle, that essentially they didn't get into negotiations. They just sent a letter to the First Nations that said, here's what we're willing to provide you, and there wasn't any offer of negotiation in that letter. There was a mediation service that was established so that if a First Nation wanted to go to mediation, if they felt that you know, their claim wasn't being evaluated the right way by the department, there was a mediation service. However, the department had set that mediation service up within the department itself, so the First Nations didn't see it as truly independent, and therefore it was only used once in the you know, in the process that we saw. Also, the department was not sharing, didn't share the information, you know, when they did an assessment about a claim, you know, they didn't share that information with the First Nations. So I can't draw a specific correlation between the budget reduction and the lack of success in the program. What I can say is it was one of the barriers we identified amongst many barriers that meant that the program didn't achieve what it was intended to.
Were you able to identify the number of claims that were underfunded, that weren't funded as a result of the cut in funding?
No, we didn't look at it at sort of the individual level, you know, which First Nations would like to research a claim but don't have the funding. We didn't look at it at that sort of level of granularity. What we were looking at was, did the program achieve what it was supposed to? And I think, again, as I said in my opening statement, they said things like they wanted to resolve more claims than they received, but they were only able to do that twice. So, you know, overall our issue was the program didn't achieve what it was intended to achieve, and there were a number of reasons why.
The second area that I'd like to focus on that also was a big concern, I mean there's so many, but we're running out of time, is around negotiations and negotiators. In the negotiations process, as we've seen in many testimonies, it goes on and on and on, and then it's on again, off again type of process, and some of that being that in the level of debt that, once again reflecting back to the funding formula, the amount of debt that's accumulated as this on again, off again process ensues, and I guess the lack of determination to actually find an outcome that could be arrived at that both organizations could agree to. It was almost like it was intentional to draw out the process to increase the level of debt through the funding program. And then finally, around the lack of mandate on behalf of the negotiators to actually truly be able to negotiate a final settlement, that they didn't have that mandate, and nor were the negotiators for all the different departments that needed to be at the table were not present as well. Can you elaborate kind of on those issues that have arisen? Oh, sorry.
I'll ask Mr. Martyr to deal with it.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief. On the specific topic of negotiations, it's covered in paragraphs 639 through 644. Again, that's an area that was considered a barrier, the way they conducted negotiations, specifically for small claims. They impose some unilateral changes as part of the reforms. For example, the take it or leave it offers for claims that are valued at $3 million. The $3 million amount is itself determined by the department without consultations with the First Nations. They also changed the way that they would actually negotiate in terms of developing a plan that would guide the negotiation process. Prior to Justice at Last, there was a plan that was mutually agreed to. That was discontinued, so that was also something that the First Nations talked about. And, okay, thank you.
Next round. Moving on to MP Kathy MacLeod.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. You know, clearly I think the intention of Justice at Last was a good intention. I think your audit report clearly identified some issues in terms of it achieving what it was supposed to achieve, and certainly in the next hour we'll look forward to hearing from the officials in terms of, you know, what your recommendations were and how they've actually moved forward since that time. So I think that's going to be, of course, a very important part of this meeting. I do want to start in terms of the Labrador and Inuit and Lands Claim Agreement. And I guess my first question is you talk about issues with Fisheries and Oceans Canada, about the share, and so I guess what's in your minds, was the agreement very clear about how that share should be apportioned out, and was it something that was just not moved forward, or was there ambiguity within the agreement itself that made it complicated to move forward on that issue?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I think you know, both the government and the federal government and the Nunatsuavik government.
We'll recommence the meeting, and it was our library analyst who, this was his second day on the job, young man, Olivier. We wish him well and thank the responders, and especially MP Kathy MacLeod. Her nursing experience came to the forefront as she looked after the situation. So let's recommence. We do have important business, so I'm going to ask us to continue, and I understand the agreement is that we will continue for this hour as scheduled, so it leaves approximately 25 minutes of question and answer. And we had just moved to MP Kathy MacLeod.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And if you recall, I was looking at the issue of clarity within the agreement that was easily interpretable versus a lack of clarity, which made it more difficult in terms of the Labrador Inuit Land Claims Agreement.
Yes. So thank you, Madam Chair. And so what we found was both the federal government and the Nunatsuvet government had different interpretations of what the federal government had committed to on the fishery side. I think essentially, and we talk about it, in paragraph 3.38 of the report. It starts at 3.38 and goes on for a number of paragraphs. I think the way to characterize it is the Nunatsuvet government felt that they were entitled essentially to 11% of the harvest of shrimp in the particular zones, and the federal government felt that that wasn't always the case. They felt that there were certain circumstances under which the Nunatsuvet government's quota should increase and others where it should not increase, whereas the Nunatsuvet government's view of it was anytime there was a change that they should get 11%. So I think that the department's position, for example, was that if they issued new licenses, then the Nunavut government would be entitled to an increase in quota. But what they actually did was they didn't increase licenses, but they increased, I believe, quota under some of the licenses. And the Nunavut government felt that that meant that they should get also an increase, but the Department of Fisheries felt that because they hadn't issued new licenses, even though they had increased the overall quota, that didn't trigger the increase for the Nunavut government.
So I guess the question for me would be, should that have been something that was more specific and clear within the actual agreement, and would we have sort of circumvented that as an issue, or is there some very compelling reasons that the flexibility needed to be required and that there was this sort of disconnect?
So I think that's always the problem with agreements. You can't always foresee every situation that is going to come about. I mean, obviously, it's best to have agreements that cover as many situations as you can think of and cover them clearly so that there isn't ever any dispute, but there always ends up, being some situation that arises. I think the issue for us really, and we mentioned it in paragraph 3.56 of our audit, was that there was a dispute mechanism built into the land claims agreement to resolve a certain number of issues, but that dispute mechanism was never used.
Okay.
So I think it's about having a clear agreement, but then also having a dispute mechanism that's going to work. And I think it's critical to make sure your dispute mechanism is going to work, because there's always going to be some disagreements.
Okay. So the other comment that you made, which I found kind of interesting, and we have heard this, I mean, I had always presumed that there would be a system in place to track the status of the obligations under the agreement. We have a number of agreements across the country. I know in our travels, concerns have been raised. So would you say that is specific to this agreement, or have you got anything to indicate in a more general way that there is a lack of systems to, as you stated in your opening comments, paragraph 14?
And again, we cover this in our report on the implementing the Labrador Inuit Land Claims Agreement, starting really, I guess, in paragraph 3.85. And we do note in there that the Department of what was then Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development Canada had a plan to expand their capabilities to track the obligations. But at the time that we did the audit, they had a system called the Treaty Obligation Monitoring System, and we felt that system, they were still having trouble getting all of the obligations into the system, and they weren't tracking as well, sort of what the benefits were from implementing the obligations. So at the time we had done the audit, we felt that the department was not sufficiently tracking the obligations associated with these treaties.
Thank you. So I want to turn now in terms of the specific claims. And, as we sort of indicated, I think there was certainly good intentions. You had 8 recommendations. If you were going to be us in the next panel, out of your recommendations, which one would you be asking the officials? Which one would you sort of deem the most important question for us to ask if they have acted upon?
Well, I guess I'll start with when we make recommendations. You'll notice in any of our audits that we tend not to make a lot of recommendations. We try and make just a few recommendations. In this case, I believe, as you mentioned, it was 8 recommendations. So, for us, when we make a recommendation, it's because we feel it's an important thing to put in place. So we don't really try and rank the recommendations. I think probably the issue is balancing off, can they just fix the issues we identified by implementing on our recommendations, or does there need to be more of a sort of go back to square one on, what's that relationship going to be? But if you go back to square one, does that put everything, behind again, right? So I think, I think that fundamentally, it's important for the department to act on our recommendations. They put together an action plan. They presented an action plan to the Public Accounts Committee about how they were going to deal with all of the recommendations and by when they were going to deal with it. So, you know, I wouldn't try and identify any one particular recommendation as being important. I think what's important at this stage is for the department to be able to demonstrate that they have implemented their action plan.
Okay. Thank you.
Questioning now moves to MP Romeo Saganash.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Madam Chair, I'm still rather troubled what happened earlier. And I noted to Mr. Ferguson earlier how I realized how much his French has improved since he is in his position. So I'd like to congratulate Mr. Ferguson for all the efforts he's made to improve his French. First, I'd like to ask a very general question. It's been more than 30 years I've been working on this Indigenous file, and I haven't seen a lot of improvement on several levels. Despite the fact that Canada is one of the richest countries on the planet, but the conditions for Indigenous peoples today remain deplorable, at the least, in my opinion. In the Auditor General's law, section 8.1, I believe, you can study urgent questions, pressing issues. In your opinion, to the best of your memory, has this article been evoked with regard to the living conditions of Indigenous peoples in Canada? Madam Chair, I can say that we did conduct several audits on several topics with regard to the Indigenous file. We conducted audits on policing services,
education, health on reserves. Nous avons effectué beaucoup de...
So we did a lot of work on this because this file involves a lot of risks for the government, and we've also said that the government does not follow its own policy with regard to these programs. So we have identified this as a particular challenge. So we've placed a lot of resources and done a lot of work on this file because it's important to audit these programs and to make sure they're functioning as planned. Several witnesses have come before this committee for the study, and several witnesses have said that there should be a human rights framework with regard to Indigenous peoples in Canada. I remember with regard to Chilcotin, the Supreme Court mentioned the Charter and provisions in the second part for Indigenous peoples. So the Supreme Court mentioned particular provisions. So should we seriously consider this possibility? The United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples should be a framework for our country with regard to treaty rights and also with regard to all these processes, namely the land treaty process. Should we have a human rights framework and approach based on this in our country, in your opinion? Because I think human rights are part of your mandate as the Auditor General, correct? Thank you, Madam Chair. Our role, once again, is to conduct audits. I do not want to or cannot comment on the government's policies. Our role is to examine the programs and to determine whether departments are implementing these programs as planned. And we determine whether departments are respecting their policies and the way they implement their programs. So it's up to the committee to decide what framework is necessary with regard to these challenges. For us, what's important is for departments to make commitments, and they have to determine how they're going to deliver their programs, and it's important for departments to adhere to their own policies so that these programs are implemented as planned. And it's our role is to make sure whether departments are respecting the proper policies and procedures in place for their programs. Finally, I think I have roughly a minute left. What have always troubled me as an MP is that every year we don't know exactly how much money the federal government is spending to fight Indigenous peoples in the courts. I think we already had a meeting on this topic, you and me. Do you not think in this era of reconciliation, do you not think that this is one question we also have to look at today? I think it's important, once again, to examine the program and all aspects of it. What are the results of the program, and also what are the costs? We have to look at the performance of it. So yes, it's an important question in the examination and the evaluation of a program. We have to identify all the results and the costs, and we have to determine whether there's value for the money in the program, and is it reasonable to spend a said sum of money to achieve the results.
MP T.J. Harvey.
Mr. Ferguson, it's always good to see you. I guess my questions, are around paragraph 5 in your opening remarks to start with. So in the end of paragraph 5, it says, furthermore, the department stated that every reasonable effort would be made to achieve settlements through negotiations. However, we found that more claims were either closed by the department or ended up in litigation than were resolved through negotiation. Did you receive a response from the department as to why they felt it was their prerogative? How does that look? How does the department just close claims? Wouldn't all claims have to go to litigation or to some form of mediation?
So we did provide a definition of closed claims, and a claim that's closed during which is a claim that is closed during negotiation because a First Nation does not accept or respond to a settlement offer or decides to withdraw its claim. So when a claim is closed, negotiations cease, and the government's outstanding lawful obligation remains, and the claim is unresolved. So that was what happened, I think, for example, again, in the cases where the small value claims that I referred to, so where the government provided an offer but without an additional offer of negotiating the amount that was offered. So many times the First Nation just didn't accept or didn't respond to that. So the department determined those to be closed, and we felt it wasn't reasonable to refer to closed cases as essentially something that was a success. To us, a case needed to be resolved so that parties said, yes, we have come to the end of this and we have reached an actual settlement, rather than we've closed the case, which means it's still out there. The First Nation wasn't happy, perhaps, and hasn't responded. that's not really a good measure of success.
And the department, I believe, they did issue an action plan to your recommendations. Is that correct?
They issued an action plan, presented an action plan to the Public Accounts Committee after the audit, yes.
Right. And has there been any follow-up on as to how their progress has been since then in implementing some of the actionable items they laid out in their action plan?
So we haven't gone back to do a follow-up audit. Again, we tend to give departments a few years to actually put in place the changes that they've said. I think in the department's action plan, a number of the actions have dates that go into 2018 before they say they will be done. But again, I think that would be a reasonable role for this committee, would be to see whether the department is on track to meet its obligation, or what it said it was going to do under the action plan.
In paragraphs 7 and 8, I guess you, in both those paragraphs, you alluded to a lack of information, and I guess also in paragraph 14, where it states, lastly, we found Indigenous Northern Affairs Canada did not have an effective system to track status of federal government's obligation under the agreement. And I think that Selma would agree with me, coming from Public Accounts Committee, that that's something that we've seen as an ongoing trend, is a lack of credible information and the ability of government to gather that information and put it into a form that's usable. Do you think that that contributes to the problems within the department as it pertains to this issue?
Well, I think, in terms of the obligations that the department has under various treaties, I think it is, obviously for them to know whether they are whether the federal government is living up to its side of the treaties, it needs to know what are the obligations, right? So having an inventory of those obligations and knowing who's responsible for them and whether they are being done and whether they are achieving what they are supposed to be achieving, I think is, very critical to the department's management of the federal government's obligations under these treaties. So I think that is very important. I think in terms of the specific claims process, the issues we raised there, what we were concerned with was, I believe it was that the tribunal, the specific claims tribunal, which is at the end of the process, I believe they had rendered 14 decisions on specific claims that had gotten all the way to the tribunal, and I believe 12 of those they found in favor of the First Nations. So our concern was we didn't see any real evidence that the department was, for example, looking at why the specific claims tribunal was so often finding in favor of the First Nations, and whether that's something that they should be going back and considering in their process of negotiation and making offers.
Okay, I've got one more question for you, and then I think that'll be it for me. But I want to ask you this question in regards to this entire situation. And I know, having had the opportunity to speak with you on several occasions about other contentious files in other departments, do you feel that this is a good example of perhaps a department or a portion of a department that could require more frequent audits? Within Public Accounts Committee, we do a lot of talking about follow-ups and how the cycle lends itself to be so onerous that by the time you get through an audit and then you get to a follow-up audit, it's so far down the road that committee members have changed, and perhaps we work in large cycles, 6-year and 8-year cycles. Do you think that more frequent audits by your department is something that could be or should be seen as a benefit?
As I said earlier, we're in this department a lot, right? We do a lot of audits that touch on the Indigenous files, so we do a lot of audits. In order to be able to, keep doing audits and go back and do follow-up audits on, everything that we've done, that would take a lot of resources. So I think that there needs to be multiple ways of getting at this. That, yes, we will go back and do follow-up audits from time to time, but again, the department has issued an action plan for what they intend to do, particularly on, on both of these audits, right? But, on the specific claims and on the the Labrador Inuit land claims. So I think really, again, if this committee, the Public Accounts Committee, whatever, if the committees use part of their time to hold the departments accountable to explain whether they are doing what they said they were going to do and, how they can demonstrate that, I think that can help add, perhaps as much value as an additional audit.
That ends the time for you, TJ, and we have 1 minute for MP Arnold Viersen.
And I'd like to acknowledge that I negotiated for this 1 minute. So,
reasonable chairperson.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Chair. Thank you for being here today. I just got a quick question. This committee has heard from past representatives of the specific claims tribunal, and they told us one of the challenges that they have in advancing and resolving claims is a lack of judges. Did you touch on that at all in your report? And if you didn't touch on it in your report, you probably brushed up against it. Could you just give us a little feedback on that?
So, Madam Chair, we didn't touch on it in either of these audits, though we did come across that issue in another audit that we had done, which was on Governor and Council appointments. I've forgotten the date of that. It would have been somewhere in that 2015-2016 time period where we did an audit on Governor and Council appointments. Spring of 2016, I'm being told. And certainly in that, we were, we did identify the problem with that there were not enough judges being appointed to the specific claims tribunal.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That concludes this session of the hearings, and I want to thank you for your attendance and your patience. And the meeting is suspended for a short time until it reconvenes with the Department of Indigenous Affairs. going to call the meeting back to order, and this is the second panel for today, and we are very pleased to have with us the Department of Indigenous Affairs and Northern Development, Mr. Joe Weil, Stephen Gagnon, and Heather McLean. Is that correct? Yes. Welcome. We have a few questions for you, but before that, you have 10 minutes to do your presentation on the topic of comprehensive and specific land claims, and the microphone is turned over to you. I understand, Joe, are you going to be leading the... All right, your turn, 10 minutes.
Thank you, and I'll try to be very brief. Bonjour, Madame la Présidente, et membres.
Morning, Madam Chair and members, and thank you for inviting me today.
The Director General of the Policy Development and Coordination Branch, and Stephen Gagnon, who is the Director General of the Specific Claims Branch, and I'm the Senior Assistant Deputy Minister responsible for Treaties and Aboriginal Government, and both of my colleagues report to me. I do want to acknowledge that we are meeting on traditional Algonquin territory, and I'm here today to provide some clarity and information about our federal negotiation processes, the roles and responsibilities of federal negotiators, and how we are working with our Indigenous partners to make our processes more efficient and responsive to priorities. So as I'm sure you are all aware, modern treaty negotiations are very complex undertakings. They address a broad spectrum of subject matter, from formation of new governments, ownership of lands and resources, and new fiscal relationships with the federal government. Le processus de négociation de l'entente.
The average negotiation process from framework agreement to final agreement takes approximately 18 years to complete. Close to 2 years of that is spent seeking federal approvals.
Partners have called on us to streamline the federal approvals process to expedite progress in negotiations. And Canada has recently taken steps to create efficiencies in the federal mandating and approval process for Section 35 related negotiations. The Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations can now sign preliminary agreements such as framework agreements and memoranda of understanding, as well as agreements in principle that are within the federal policy framework upon the recommendation of the Federal Steering Committee. The Federal Steering Committee is a group of Assistant Deputy Ministers from the departments that are most implicated in treaty negotiations. In addition, the Minister can also, with the support of the negotiating parties and the recommendation of the Federal Steering Committee, expedite negotiations to the final agreement stage by skipping the agreement in principle stage or converting a substantively complete agreement in principle into a final agreement. These steps will help to maintain momentum at negotiating tables and serve to truncate the federal role in the negotiation process, which should help in Indigenous groups to be able to benefit from agreements sooner. With respect to the role of federal negotiators in the negotiation process, we know that positive negotiated outcomes are best achieved when the parties at the table can build a relationship that's founded on trust and respect. And we do recognize that we need to ensure that there is consistency in federal negotiation teams, and we do make best efforts to keep the same negotiators at the same tables for as many years as possible. Based on our records, we tried to estimate what the average time was that a negotiator spends at a table, and the average is around 7 years. But we do realize that when you take into account that the actual negotiation process for a modern treaty and a self-government agreement can take somewhere on average between 15 to 20 years, that does mean that there is some turnover of negotiators. We do recognize that we want to minimize the amount of times that we do have that turnover, because it can mean lost momentum at the table, as well as significant time spent to bring a new negotiator up to speed. Ultimately, we know that we have to find ways to do agreements more quickly and more efficiently. And in an effort to do so, we began establishing recognition of Indigenous rights and self-determination discussion tables in 2015. These negotiations are founded on an interest-based recognition of rights approach, and they allow Canada and Indigenous groups to co-develop negotiation mandates for cabinet approval. So it's a completely different way of having the conversation. The discussions aim to produce results much more quickly by honing in on key shared priorities and finding ways to accelerate or presenting alternatives to the process requirements that come with predetermined federal mandates. I would also say that we are looking at a variety of instruments now, and we don't have a narrow definition of the meaning of treaty. Agreements can be on specific subject matters and not have to be all-encompassing on everything. We have signed 15 preliminary agreements with Indigenous groups through the rights recognition discussions. Et nous demeurons déterminés à travailler avec nos partenaires autochtones.
We remain committed to working with our Indigenous negotiation partners towards more collaborative, flexible mandates and processes to address key issues in negotiations and to help all parties realize the benefit of these agreements more quickly.
Brief remarks, and we are pleased to take your questions.
Thank you very much. Questioning first goes to MP Zahid.
Yes. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses today. My first question is that due to the time frame for the handling of the comprehensive claims, it seems possible that the financial state of the claimants could fluctuate, especially when debt load is concerned. So how does the current comprehensive land claim system accommodate for the debt amounts within the Indigenous communities involved with the claims? And do you have any suggestions for how can the comprehensive land claims process be further updated or refined to better address the financial standing of these communities before, like, during and after the claim have been processed?
So the funding that's currently provided is a mixture of loans and contributions that are not repayable. We've been aware for a number of years now that there are issues around the accumulation of loan debt, particularly as some of these processes have continued on for so many years. We are looking at ways in which we can address the issues associated with loan debt. And I think that, you know, there is certainly a fairness concern. The original intent was I guess the original thinking behind this was that loans would help to ensure that everyone at the table would have a certain discipline in moving the negotiations forward. I think there's a clear recognition based on the experience now over the last 20, 30 years that that's not the case, and loans don't actually provide any real incentive to move things along quicker at the table. And in some ways, you know, the issues are more specific around how we've approached mandates and the kinds of bases on which we've had discussions. So I think in looking at the totality of what we want to reform around that particular process, and that includes even moving away from the nomenclature of claims and talking about it more from a recognition perspective, I think we understand that we need to do some, you know, real analysis around whether or not there's a different approach that we could be taking on funding that would address the loan burden and the fairness issue around that loan burden.
Question is, as we know that the claims process incorporates claims for dozens of Indigenous communities across Canada. As a result, the process must incorporate and be sensitive to the values and the needs of the communities who are involved in that. So does the claims process for both specific as well as comprehensive claims have mechanisms in place to deal differently with these respective communities? And do you have any recommendations for the flexibility of the claims can be improved to increase the efficiency and satisfaction level of the claims?
I mean, they're very different processes and they're very different types of discussions. So, you know, I mean, again, I don't like the label of comprehensive land claims. What we're really talking about are treaty negotiations and self-government negotiations under that rubric. So that really is about self-determination. And I think the way we would want to frame that work today and the work that we are trying to do is to frame it as recognition of rights and self-determination. And that's, you know, I think what we're trying to do there. Specific claims is a different category altogether. And you're trying to address the historical wrongs of the government and figuring out what is the best way to compensate for those wrongs. So two completely different processes with two completely different, I think, methods of negotiation and dialogue around how we're trying to approach them. I do think that for both, we are in the middle of trying to figure out with our Indigenous partners how we want to actually reform these processes so that they work better for everyone. I think we recognize that they take too long whether it's a self-determination dialogue, whether it's a specific claim negotiation. It takes too long. They're too adversarial in the way that we have approached them in the past, and we are trying to find ways to reform those processes. So with specific claims in particular, there's a partnership that we have with the Assembly of First Nations, as well as a number of other Indigenous groups, including the Union of British Columbia Indian Chiefs and others from across the country, where we are trying to develop together what will be the reforms that are necessary to that process in order to put it on a footing that is more commensurate with the type of relationship that we're striving to achieve with Indigenous people. At the same time, the work that we're doing through the rights recognition and self-determination tables are, I think, piloting ways in which we can have a completely different approach to the question of self-determination and how to expedite agreements in a much more efficient way to enable whether it's First Nations, whether it's Métis, whether it's Inuit, to take on areas of jurisdiction and responsibility that they want to take on sooner than having to wait for a 15 or 20-year process.
Share my time with my colleague, Mr. Amos.
Thank you, Deputy Mr. Wild. Thank you for recognizing that we are on unceded Algonquin territory. My Algonquin constituents would look at some of the issues that are currently being discussed with the federal government. They have a specific land claim process, but there's also an ongoing discussion around their proper role vis-a-vis Parliament Hill, Supreme Court, and lands proximate to downtown. How would you characterize that type of discussion in relation to the comprehensive land claims and the specific claims? Is it some kind of sui generis process? How would you describe that to the people of Kitigan-Zibi?
So certainly the negotiations that we have underway with the Algonquins of Ontario is a comprehensive land claim dialogue. There is also interest in having a self-government agreement as well, but the focus has been on resolving the land claim first. And then you have, separate from that, a discussion going on with Kitigan-Zibi, which is under our new process, part of a rights recognition, self-determination dialogue that we have started with Chief White Duck. And I think our approach to those dialogues, while originally fairly distinct, are now coming together in that the approach really is sitting down and trying to have an interest-based discussion, hearing what the Indigenous community is saying are their priorities and interests, and then working together to develop the kinds of mandates that we need to be able to be responsive to those interests. And that's really the focus of how we're trying to have those dialogues now, whether it's under the kind of old comprehensive land claim policy or whether it's under the recognition of rights self-determination tables.
That ends the time allocated. I'd encourage you to look for hand signals where once in a while. Thanks. MP Kevin Waugh, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Auditor General was just here talking about the 8 recommendations. How are you doing on the 8?
Steve Gagnon can provide you with an update.
Yeah, so thank you. Thank you for the question. Thank you, Madam Chair. As Joe just said, we're putting a lot of our eggs in the working group that we have being facilitated by the AFN. I can't tell you that things have changed drastically yet. I can tell you that I think it's been a constructive, productive process, and we are working at it, but we haven't made recommendations yet or haven't received recommendations yet on how to move forward. So I think things are going well, but it's anecdotal at this point. I don't have much more. But I do think they're going well.
But you can't really update us, or it's going well, but you got nothing to report, which tells me it's not going well.
Okay. Sorry. So, when we started this work, we focused on 4 major areas: claims over $150 million, public reporting, funding for negotiations, and the use of mediation. So the context, as I interpreted for a lot of the things that were in the Auditor General's report and other reports, said that in 2007, when we launched Justice at Last, there was promise of more cooperation, and then once we got going, Canada kind of went into its shell and didn't talk to people anymore. So most of the recommendations in the Auditor General's report and others were you need to get back out there and start speaking to people, start communicating, start listening. And we have been doing that, so I think we have made progress. That it's self-serving for me to say that I think it's going better, but I'm hopeful that my colleagues in the First Nation side would say that there is better communication now than there was, and that was a major first step for us to get that kind of thing going. So,
I think, and I was part of the tour that we made, Vancouver, Winnipeg, Belleville, and Quebec City, the lack of trust between the two groups. Can it ever be repaired? Let's start there. Wherever we went, that was the #1 issue. They do not trust the federal government, and I don't know if that can be repaired. I want to know your views on it, because it was the topic of conversation.
So I absolutely think it can be repaired, and I think it's about a couple of things. One, I think it is about approaching the relationship from the right perspective. And that means approaching the relationship from, the mandate that we've been given as public servants from the Prime Minister to renew a nation-to-nation relationship based on recognition of rights.
Yeah, what is nation-to-nation? Can I ask that? Because we had the Premier of Quebec come out and he would like an explanation what nation-to-nation is. You've got provinces in this country, you have territories in this country that have no idea what nation-to-nation is. And yet you have the Prime Minister going around this country talking about nation-to-nation. So what is nation-to-nation? Can you fill us in? Because the premiers of this country have no idea what that means.
So I think, again, I mean, I wouldn't characterize all premiers in the same basket in terms of their understanding of nation-to-nation based on certainly the conversations that I have with my provincial colleagues. Nation-to-nation is, I think, getting at the base of the idea that you have to approach this relationship based on recognition of rights, respect, cooperation, and partnership. It means that there is a concept of Indigenous nations. Some of that has been severely disrupted through the actions of past governments when the Indian Act and the band system was established in this country. And it really is about how you work with First Nations as they work through, their own processes within their communities to figure out whether or not there is a larger collective than a band that speaks on behalf of the Section 35 rights holders of that community. That collectivity is what we would recognize as a nation, and we're not prescribing what that collectivity means. There's been work obviously done on this in the past. There was a Royal Commission, an Aboriginal Peoples Report in the 90s that talked about it as being around language groups. That may be one possibility, but there are other possibilities as well, and we're not precluding or closing the door to any concept. We're saying that I think our role as a government is to support First Nations and having that dialogue internally so that they can work out within their communities what they think those groups are that represent larger collectives of rights holders and that they want to recognize as being their governments for the purposes of having a nation-to-nation dialogue with Canada and with a province or territory.
In Winnipeg, we were talking about the additions to reserves, the process in Manitoba, because we're in Manitoba at the time, but it also affects my province of Saskatchewan. So where are we at on this land, this treaty land entitlement claims? How many are outstanding? And you've talked about time here, and time seems to be precious for years, but what is average time required then for resolving some of these claims?
I have to get back to you on the numbers around the treaty land entitlement. I don't have those numbers at my fingertips, nor do I have the average time it takes to resolve them. Yeah. I can say that we've made significantly more progress in Saskatchewan than we have in Manitoba. Yeah. And I think we are continuing to look at ways in which we have to do things in order to ameliorate the processes that are in place in Manitoba in particular.
Good. There seemed to be a lot of frustration in the province of Manitoba. We certainly felt that, and yet in my province of Saskatchewan, it seems to be a little bit more reconciliation, if you might say so. Well, it's interesting. The Auditor General, I know you guys follow them very closely, and I applaud you for that. One size doesn't fit all. There's the other thing. So, you know, you're talking about quickly and more efficiently. Be careful with that. And I understand, and we went to places where there's agreements that have gone on for 30 and 40 years. But sometimes when you do it quickly, and the auditor did talk about that, you miss something. So when you go quickly, you're going to miss more, and then we're going to have more issues. So there has to be a balance here. Okay?
And the questioning now goes to MP Romeo Saganash.
Merci. Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Welcome, all three of you, to our committee. I'm from a region that signed the first modern treaty in Canada in 1975, and this treaty took roughly 1 year to negotiate. It was very complex. In 74, we signed an agreement in principle that was roughly 14 pages long, and the final agreement was 15 pages. Oh, sorry, 500 pages. So it's not necessarily a question of complexity, in my opinion. These negotiations involve more a political will and good faith. In your presentation, you said that on average, negotiating a modern treaty takes 15 to 20 years to conclude. So how can you explain then that for Inuits in Quebec, we're now at more than 30 years of negotiations for these two groups? So it's almost double the time that's average. You're right. I don't have a good explanation for this. I can't say why the negotiations with Inuits are taking an average of 30 years.
You know, it's been, I would say, you know, in my time in this position, it has been one of the biggest challenges is unpacking why does it take so long in some communities, and you know what's part of the problem. And I think some of it has been the way that we had approached the fundamentals of these discussions. And you know, there's been lots of criticism about the comprehensive land claim policy as being a policy about rights termination. And I think we've had issues in that we haven't been able to approach negotiations from a truly interest-based approach. Negotiators were going out with, you know, predefined mandates, predefined policy frames, and when a community would present things that would diverge from that, it would bring everything to a halt. Well, negotiators would have to go back and try to sort out whether or not they could get a change to mandate in order to address the interest that was put before them. I think that the approach we're trying to take now, which is to say, let's start with a blank page, some fundamental understandings around the UN Declaration, around Section 35, around what it means to take a recognition approach. And let's work together to build what would have to then be the mandate that I would go and seek from Cabinet. I think that will make things go significantly faster, because it means that we will have had a more thorough conversation about what the actual interests are from the Indigenous group's perspective. I don't have a good answer for how we've gotten to the 30 years that we have spent with the Innu. My hope is that we will not have to spend another 30.
Could it be a question of mandate or lack of mandate thereof in this case?
Pardon me?
Could it be a question of mandate in this case or lack thereof?
Certainly, I think I would say that if you looked at what the Innu were looking for at the table and what the scope of mandate was that we had at the table, that gap was significant and definitely part of the issue. And that's not just a money issue. I want to say that's about more fundamental things as well. And those are challenges to sort out sometimes, and I think we are working at trying to figure out ways to address some of those challenges. But yes, I would say definitely it is at least partially a mandate issue. Some of it is policy approaches, and in some cases, you know, it goes to expectations around how decision-making is going to work in the community. We have had issues where the requirements we have around community ratifications have caused problems and issues. So there's a whole host of different things that I think contribute to it, and I would say what underlies most of that is a failure on our part to have appreciated that we need to approach these negotiations from the perspective that we're building an agreement to act as a bridge between that Indigenous community system of governance and Canada's. And instead, we've kind of taken a view of everything is kind of from our perspective, and we build agreements on that basis. And I think that is part of a failure in how we've gone about the process, and I think that contributes to the length of the process.
I'm intrigued by, just to finish off, my time is running out, but I'm intrigued by the choice of words that you're using. And you're talking about recognition of rights or rights recognition approach that you now use. I think personally that's already a constitutional obligation on the part of the government or with respect to Indigenous rights in this country. And I would make a distinction between rights recognition and respect for the fundamental rights of Indigenous peoples in this country. Recognizing the rights of Indigenous people is already a constitutional obligation as determined by, in particular, the Supreme Court of the highest court of this country. So I want you to explain that distinction between rights recognition and respect for rights.
So the distinction, I guess, would be that the way the comprehensive claims policy and the inherent right policy were built was on the basis that the Indigenous group had to prove the scope of the right that they were seeking to have recognized in the treaty. So the starting premise was you have to prove what the rights are that we are actually going to be discussing as part of this. And I think a recognition approach is saying we're not starting from an assumption that there is nothing there. We're starting from the assumption that there is a full box of rights, and we now need to talk about what you see as being the priority rights and how you see implementing those rights, and that should be the nature of the discussion. I think that gets to the respect part, is about focusing the conversation on an implementation conversation around the right, as opposed to focusing it on defining the scope of the right for all time immemorial. And I think that's been the failure of the prior process, was focusing too much on that question.
The rights.
That ends our question period for you, MP Saganash. We now have two more speakers by agreement, and that will be MP Ananda Sangri and MP Veerson. To conclude the public session, then we'll have a short in-camera session where we'll talk about committee business. MP Ananda Sangri.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. I have some very specific questions, and first, with respect to extinguishment of rights. I know we've had, as Mr. Wallace said, we've gone across the country, and one of the things that came up over and over again is the issue of extinguishment. Is that something that Canada is now insisting, or is it, from a policy perspective, is it something that's now off the table with the negotiations that are currently coming to finality?
So I think from Canada's perspective, certainly in the modern treaty era, so post-1970, our perspective is that none of what we were doing was about extinguishment, but we understand that from certain perspectives, some of what we were doing looked like extinguishment. And so what we've tried to do in the approach that we're taking with the recognition of rights and self-determination tables is by focusing more on how to implement the right versus trying to define the scope of the right. We think that helps to reduce the perception that this is really about extinguishment. And I want to be really clear that, you know, the government mandate that I have and the policy direction from the government is that I am not in the business of extinguishing rights. I am not in the business of rights termination. That is not what we are trying to accomplish through the tables and the dialogue that we are having. But we are, you know, I would say sensitive that some perceive it in that way.
It's very, you know, across the country, I would say over a dozen negotiators and nations that have been in negotiations have confirmed that that is something that the government of Canada has insisted on. So my question to you is that something now that you're no longer pursuing as as a demand in terms of final agreement?
If you're referring to the approach that was taken to what they call certainty provisions and the notion of full and final agreements, yes, our policy has shifted, and certainly we are open to a broad swath of agreement types, and we no longer insist the only agreement has to be a full and final. And like I say, we've moved away from the idea that the purpose of the agreement should be to define the full scope of the right in that way. We are trying to build agreements now that have built into them that concept of periodic review or an orderly process, which allows for the parties to revisit how we have described the implementation of the rights to ensure that these agreements are working for both parties and can evolve as the governance of both parties will evolve over time.
So, one of the other major concerns that came across, and you've identified it in your statement, is with respect to changing negotiators and negotiating teams. I mean, you indicate the average year, I think 7 years is what you had said. We've heard, matter of 20 years, they've had 7 different negotiators. So I think it's, there's a range there, obviously, and you're talking about the average, and some may have different experiences. Now, how do we change it to a point where, we do have a consistency in negotiation and negotiators? Because ultimately, I think, the individual who's sees the file is the one that brings it to conclusion. But if you keep changing the person every few years, and then obviously for career development and so on, that'll naturally happen. How do we mitigate that, and how do we ensure that there's some consistency in our negotiating position, and that we don't just keep changing negotiators every few years, even if it's 7 years and a 20-year agreement, you're literally set back 3 years right off the top.
So we do not have any policy or practice of just randomly changing negotiators after a certain amount of time. If there's a change in negotiators, it's either because someone is taking a form of leave, or they've taken a promotion, or they've decided to pursue employment elsewhere, or they've retired. I do think that there's a balance in this that one has to be careful of. We do have examples, I think, of negotiators who have been on files for too long, where they've had the same table for 20 years. That causes me a concern about why we're not continuing to kind of move things forward. But we don't have any, we don't rotate. There is no planned rotation. So the changes occur when people basically are making personal decisions in their own career planning about, what they're doing. So it's kind of hard, right, to figure out, well, it's the same thing around, I get uncomfortable about, well, what's the right length of time for a negotiation to take too? All of these things kind of take the time that they take, and it's going to vary considerably depending on the parties and the interest that you're trying to address. So I do think, just to be clear about that, I think we try to maintain stability, and the only time we make changes is when we're forced into that situation because there are things going on. Sometimes we do get requests from our negotiating partners to actually change out the negotiators because they don't like how something is going on in the room. Those are very difficult conversations, and we try to work our way through them. But we don't have any practice of just randomly switching people out.
Just come back to the issue of timelines, and I know you had indicated that 20 years is a timeline that for comprehensive claims, and obviously for specific claims it's a set process. But I think 20 years is a generation, and I think the vast majority of the people that we heard from is well above the 20-year mark. I think we heard from a group that 20 years from the time of agreement in principle. So I think there is a need to kind of have a window, maybe 15 years or something that will have an impact on the people that are actually negotiating. We had a chief from Quebec who's I think just around 40, and they've been negotiating for well above his time on Earth. So I think there is a need to have some timelines. Is there a number that you would be comfortable with saying that would be reasonable and be able to come to some conclusion?
Very
I think it's really hard to put a number on there. I think it's more about trying to talk about the forms of agreement we're trying to get to and whether we can fix that in order to actually get to things faster, rather than requiring these full comprehensive agreements.
Good try. No number. Short. Okay. I don't want to cut any time from MP Viersen today.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I know I give you a rough time. I'm sure that my minutes are always smaller minutes than everyone else's. But thanks for being here today. I appreciate your taking a crack at the nation to nation. That's probably the most articulate description we've had on nation to nation up until this point. I guess I'm going to go in a similar vein as we see the 8 recommendations from the Auditor General. We just looked at some of our numbers. Back 2008, there was over 800 specific claims. Where is that number now?
Yeah, Steve Gagnon will provide it.
Well, we have 230 in negotiation. We have about 130, 40 in assessment, so we're determining whether or not we agree that there's an outstanding lawful obligation.
Okay.
But I think you heard the Auditor General refer to closed files, and so there are a number which could go to the tribunal, but haven't gone to the tribunal.
Yeah.
So that number, we think, is in the range of about 400, either because we've rejected the claim as a claim or the 3-year period for negotiations has expired. So I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth. I think some First Nation groups would say you haven't really gotten rid of those. You've just disguised them as something else. And that's one of the things we're trying to address in the working group, is to say we should at least have a common understanding of what all these terms mean so that we at least know what we're having issues about.
How many settlements have you come to, say, in the last year?
I think last year we had around 15.
15?
Yeah.
Okay, and that would be on the 20-year timeline as well?
I think the Auditor General found that in a specific claims context, the average was about 5. The mean was 5, I think he said.
Okay. Interesting. And we differentiate between specific claims and comprehensive claims, so that's the 5-year versus the 20-year. That's what I'm getting from you.
The specific claims are, as Joe said, usually more precise. There was an action or series of actions that caused harm to a First Nation. So, generally speaking, I would say they're more discrete issues. So but whereas in a comprehensive claim, you're talking potentially about self-government, you're talking about lands, resource sharing, management, co-management, that sort of thing. So I think naturally those are going to be a little bit more complicated to deal with over time.
Right. Joe, you talked a little bit about, I don't remember exactly, something assumed rights tables or something like that. How many of these tables are there?
So recognition of rights and self-determination tables, and we're somewhere around 50 of those tables now across the country.
50?
Yeah.
50?
50.
Who sits at those tables?
So it's, again, it's negotiation teams from the department, as well as sometimes negotiators from other government departments, for example, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans or Environment Canada. And then it's whoever is representing the Indigenous group that we are negotiating with.
Is there at any point other folks that are, so these tables located here in Ottawa, or are they located across the country? I guess, like, when this negotiation happens, where does it happen?
So if they're in British Columbia, for example, they will happen in British Columbia, because I have an office in British Columbia of about 75 people or so, and they look after the negotiations that cover British Columbia as well as the Yukon. And then for the rest of the country, it will normally be split. Some sessions will be held in the home communities, and then sometimes they will come to Ottawa. Okay. But the rest of the negotiators are located here out of Ottawa. Okay,
and that's, and this is kind of separate from comprehensive claims or specific claims, these tables?
That's right.
Yeah, okay. How would, say, in my former life as an automotive mechanic at a Chrysler dealer up in northern Alberta, how would I know about these tables?
I don't know that you would. And I think that actually gets to a root issue that we have, in that there's not enough information, I think, available for Canadians to actually understand some of this work and to understand what it means to have a dialogue that is based on recognition of rights, that is based on moving to actualize the vision of self-determination of Indigenous people. We do have a website. There's a website specifically for specific claims that talks about the claims and where they're at in the process. We also have a website that lists out those that are in the treaty or self-determination dialogues.
Sorry, that's the full 5 minutes, plus 13 seconds. I do want to thank you for coming out, responding to our questions, and look forward to seeing you again. I wish you all the best, speedy resolution of these claims. I don't want to get already to the report, but we have heard a theme. Thank you very much for coming, Megwitch, and that will conclude the public session. We'll take 2 minutes to kind of empty the room, and then we'll have a in-camera business session.
Thank you.